Thank you, Your Honor, for that question. To begin with, of course, we have here with us the BSP governor, and based on the existing economic conditions, based on the robust banking system, and of course, there are certain changes that have been that have occurred that have made it more. That have given the BSP more flexibility in terms of the increase of capitalization. So it was deemed by them that at this point we can afford the country can afford to capitalize the Maharlika Investment Fund. Now it should also be noted that there are provisions within the law. There is a cap which is at 50 billion. So meaning that once that threshold has been reached, the BSP will no longer be required will have no required dividends once it reaches the 50 billion peso threshold. Aside from that, there's also a provision in the law that allows the government to, if necessary, to modify the requirements or the commitments of the BSP to the Maharlika should the need arise in the future. And of course, if you look at it from a more, I guess, whole of nation approach, it was deemed that there is really a need to pump prime our economy at this point, especially given that we are recovering from COVID-19. I think that we have to look at the overall economic condition of our country, which would require us to look for additional sources of revenues for our spending, especially in the field of infrastructure. Right now, as I mentioned earlier, primarily our source of funding is through debt. The Maharlika would allow us to fund it through equity, giving us additional fiscal space and improve the overall economic condition of our country. I mean, that's if you're asking why it was deemed, why there was why there was I don't know if you'd call it a change in opinion, but yeah, I guess somewhat of a change in opinion. But I think that being said, I think it's still consistent. It's not that we don't want to increase the capitalization. It's just that, of course, there are priorities. We have to look at this at a whole, from a whole of nation perspective. And right now, there really is a need to access, or hopefully we can access additional funds that would help pump prime our economy and prevent us from entering, a worse economic condition in the short and long term.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, good sponsor, for that. Good sponsor, I do support the philosophy of using the concept of the Maharlika Investment Fund to pump prime the economy. In fact, during the hearings, I remember the resource persons, particularly the DOF, laid a very good case on how the Maharlika Investment Fund can be used as a multiplier to capital, by attracting external capital to come in or by issuing equity, Mr. President. And I see that wisdom and I support that. In fact, I support the developmental role of the Maharlika Investment Fund. However, Mr. President, I think the capitalization of BSP and the capitalization of the Maharlika Investment Fund should not be mutually exclusive. In my view, that this should be achieved simultaneously, Mr. President, because what we were made to understand that the scenario and the size of the economy, the size of the banking sector has grown tremendously over the past years, that the BSP is not equipped anymore to respond to the changing times. And let me also read for the record. Again, I'll read from the transcript because these are the discussions that were the discussions that took place during the deliberation of RA 11211, and this discussion formed part of the thought process why this representation voted in favor of the increase in capitalization. This is a statement from Deputy Governor Vicente Aquino, and this is during the September 13 hearing. And let me quote. Of course, the first major proposed amendment to the Bangko Sentral charter is the increased capitalization from 50 to 200 billion. So a proposed increase by 150 billion. Mr. Chairman, the compelling justification for this proposed major amendment is that a full and increased capitalization of 150 billion for the Bangko Sentral will ensure financial strength of the nation's central monetary authority, which is the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas. There's no gainsaying that the scale and complexity of the Bangko Sentral's responsibility has been magnified by the growth of the Philippine economy and the rapid expansion of the Philippine financial system. And it goes on. Based on the available accurate statistical data, our economy in real terms as of December 2015 was 11.3 times bigger, or has grown by a factor of 11.3 times since 1993, from 1.3 trillion in 1993 to 15.3 trillion as the end of 2015. The rapid pace of growth of the size of the banking system is actually even higher, at 12.2 times the total banking resources existing as of 1993 or in 1993. And the size of the balance sheet of the central bank has grown more than eightfold since its creation in 1993. Total assets have also risen from a measly 518 billion in 1993 to 4.3 trillion as of December 2015. And the total liabilities have similarly ballooned from 502 billion 20 years ago to 4.2 trillion as of end of December 2015. The Bangko Sentral, as a central monetary authority, has been lagging behind its peers not only in the region but also in other parts of the world. And as the nation's only central monetary authority, the BSP needs a larger or bigger capitalization to enable it to meet the growing needs of the expanding economy and the growing complexity and sophistication of our financial system. Despite all this, the authorized capitalization. Oops, puto lang. Okay. Sorry, Mr. Chairman. Where is that? And despite all this, the authorized capitalization of the BSP has remained 50 billion, which have taken more than 20 years to be fully subscribed or paid. For these compelling reasons, Mr. Chairman, we are proposing that the capitalization of the Bangko Sentral be increased by at least 150 billion to be fully subscribed by the government of the Republic of the Philippines, and the unpaid subscription shall be fully paid for by the government either in cash and or government securities upon effectivity of the law as amended, or assuming that this is amended and that the adequacy of the capitalization shall be subject to review every 5 years and adjusted upon joint recommendation by the Secretary of Finance, the Secretary of Budget and Management, and the Monetary Board of the Bangko Sentral. And the payment of the unpaid subscription and or increase in capitalization shall be automatically appropriated in the Annual General Appropriations Act, Mr. President. So, Mr. President, in short, we were made to understand that things have already changed in 2016. The economy has expanded, the banking sector has expanded, and yet the expansion of the BSP has not caught up with those two expansions. So we were made to understand, Mr. President, that we are just playing catching up, not only with our own economy and banking industry, but also with our peers. Apparently, if you compare ourselves with our regional peers, we're not at par anymore, Mr. President. So, in other words, Mr. President, based on those discussions, I voted yes, Mr. President, to increase the capitalization. And I trusted the the manifestations of Governor Tatanco. I trusted the manifestations of Deputy Governor Aquino, being the sole and central monetary authority of our country. I trusted their manifestations and their request, and therefore we have that law, Mr. President. So Mr. President, based on that, based on the transcript, Mr. President, again, I am quite concerned that there is a U-turn in terms of policy, and that U-turn, Mr. President, is not in line with the statements of the former management of the BSP. And more so, Mr. President, it's also a credibility issue, Mr. President. I don't want this to be a bad precedent for the next request from the BSP. My personal thoughts on this, Mr. President, is every time BSP will come here and come up with arguments, come up with manifestations, how can we trust them if they can all of a sudden change their tune because they want to fulfill certain change their tune and fulfill certain requirements of certain proposals, Mr. President. So it's not only digressing from the original arguments, but also a credibility issue might be at stake here, Mr. President. And this will not be the last request of the BSP. The BSP will come here for other things. And my personal opinion, it might set a bad precedent if we keep on changing because we want to fulfill certain proposals, Mr. President.
Yes, thank you, Your Honor. We are very cognizant of your concerns. Just to allay some of your concerns, I'd just like to, first of all, I'd like to mention that, of course, the increase in capitalization of the BSP, of course, will not stop. It will continue. As I said earlier, there are certain provisions in the law that would, starting with the ceiling, the limit, and also the ability to modify, if needed, the commitment of the BSP. And aside from that, another condition that is that would allow the BSP more flexibility is their ability at this point to issue its own debt securities. Alongside the institutionalization of the interest rate corridor system, the BSP has been accorded additional flexibility in the conduct of its open market operations, particularly in cases when it needs to mop up a large part of the liquidity surplus from the financial system. So these are just some of the tools, some of which are embedded in the law, some of which this was just recently a recent amendment in the BSP charter, this ability to issue its own debt securities. So that's one of the things. And aside from that, of course, at this point, we have to show some flexibility, not just given the recent conditions. Since that time that this bill, that this bill on the increase in capitalization was passed, since that time, we know that we were hit by the COVID crisis. In fact, there were a lot of the funding from the COVID response was sourced from the dividends of the BSP. For the last 2 years, they've been deferring income for GAA purposes. In 2019, 23 billion for the COVID response. In 2020, 15 billion, and in 2021, 7 billion. So that was used for the response. And now, what we're faced with is recovery. We are facing a situation much different from before, where we have fiscally, we have a higher debt to GDP ratio, which gives us less room to borrow money to fuel our expansion. In light of that, the economic managers have deemed it necessary and in the best interest of our country to find other sources of funding. And I think that's why at this point, it's important, as the BSP has done before, we look at the situation now. They used funds for the COVID response, but now our priority is the COVID recovery. Unfortunately, our fiscal situation would make it more practical at this point for us to access the capital markets, for us to access perhaps through the equity plays, through equity investments from other nations, which other institutions, which they have shown interest already, to fund our infrastructure projects. I think at this point, given when you've asked about what conditions would change the priorities of the BSP, I think the COVID-19 has changed a lot. Our fiscal position is much changed from what it was several years ago. Our fiscal position is such that it would require us to explore other sources of income, income and other sources of investment. And the Maharlika gives us a vehicle to attract investments from other countries. It gives us a vehicle to invest in our own infrastructure. It gives us an additional source of income and an additional source of capital to fuel the growth. It's very difficult at this point to just issue more debt. At this point, perhaps we need to attract equity. We need to attract investments. We need a vehicle to do so. And we believe that the Maharlika is that vehicle. And also at the same time, we agree with the BSP's commitment that at this point they can absorb these kinds of investments in Maharlika as it would improve the economic situation, the overall economic situation of our country, especially given the destruction, the economic destruction that the COVID has brought upon not just us but the whole world.
Thank you, Mr. President. And Mr. President, I do appreciate the objectives of the Maharlika investment funds. In my view, those were articulated very well during the hearings that were conducted by the good sponsor. We had a very intense and in-depth discussion during the hearings. And I truly appreciate one of the things that convinced me that time is the multiplier effect of capital. I looked at other models and seems to me that that is one of the most important selling points of sovereign wealth funds. I was also convinced by improving the safeguards in the funds. I think the Senate version, the Senate committee version is a much improved version compared to where it started. The safeguards are well improved, and I think the Senate version took into consideration a lot of the inputs from the senators and from our resource persons. But what's more important to me is really how the fund can be used to mobilize capital. I think that is one of the most or the most important feature of the funds. But again, Mr. President, my view is it should not be mutually exclusive, Mr. President. And I understand that the BSP now, from the good sponsor, is in a better position, if I am not mistaken. I understand that it has other tools that it can tap into, and it also, financially wise, it's also much stronger at its current state, Mr. President. That's what I understand from the good sponsor. But Mr. President, having said that, I also appreciated the position paper that BSP sent us, and part of the comments in the BSP letter, March 9, that let me just quote from the position paper, Mr. President. It is prudent for the BSP to work with the national government to build its financial buffers in a counter-cyclical manner, i.e. to build the buffers during good times and recapitalize when FX is appreciating and sterilization costs rise. So, Mr. President, having read this position paper, seems to me that now is a good time or the best time to recapitalize the BSP because it's experiencing adequate financial health, or in other words, or even better financial health. And I do agree. In good times like this is a time to put the house in order, put our financial books in order, come up with buffers so that when the bad times come in, whether another pandemic or a banking incident, that we're ready, Mr. President. And I do agree on a counter-cyclical approach, Mr. President. So having said this, Mr. President, and having looked at the position paper of the BSP, isn't it appropriate that now is the time to build up the capital of the BSP? We have a great opportunity now to plow back the dividends of the BSP to reach its desired 200 billion capital, Mr. President. Let us not wait for another banking disaster to happen. I hope it will not happen, whether domestically or foreign. All of with the financial world all interconnected now, a financial disaster outside of the Philippines can cascade to our shores, Mr. President. And that's why I am of the opinion that now is a good time to build that capital so that when things go sour, we're ready to respond. And the BSP, being our sole monetary authority, is there to help us, Mr. President. So I'm also looking at I'm also standing at the point of view of an ordinary consumer, wherein I want my monetary authority and regulator be strong to respond to the times, Mr. President. So that's why, Mr. President, I'm still quite concerned that we're foregoing the capitalization of BSP. And in my view, this can be achieved simultaneously, building the capital of the Maharlika Investment Fund, at the same time building the capital of the BSP. In that case, we have two strong institutions that can respond to the times, one for development, one for the banking industry and for our economy as a whole, Mr. President. So is that a possible scenario, Mr. President?
Yeah, well, of course, I appreciate the concern, and I appreciate the statement and the point that your honor is making. The reason for this, of course, is this is the product of discussions with all the relevant agencies, and of course, that's you're right. Of course, capitalization is something that is a priority, but of course, which is precisely why. There was a cap put on the amount that would be invested for the capitalization, and there was also a provision that at any time these commitments can be reviewed. That's why it was put there, so that to ensure that if the conditions should change and should there be a need, we will have the means to respond very quickly and efficiently. But of course, at this point, I mean, when we've weighed out, after weighing out all the given the current economic situation, and after weighing out all the benefits, the costs and benefits of all these, it's always give and take, with regards to these economic issues. Right now we're faced with increasing inflation. We're faced with in order to tame the inflation, we have to increase interest rates. But when you increase interest rates, of course, it's the economy that suffers. So we need, I think, at this point, we need something to pump prime the economy. We need access to additional funds because our current fiscal situation does not afford us that kind of flexibility. So this is just the balance that we struck, and this is the balance that we have to strike, and it was deemed by the economic team that this reflects that balance that is needed in order for us to maintain our economic trajectory. Not to say that the capitalization is not important, it is. That's precisely why we put these provisions in the bill, to ensure that we have the flexibility to make changes should the need arise, should the conditions change. But right now, as we see it, as the economic team sees it, we need we need to maintain the trajectory. We need to generate employment. We need the economy to be strong. At the same time, we have to tame inflation. So, it's a balancing act that we continue to do. At this point, certainly, your honor is welcome to make any. As we've always been open to suggestions, which is why we have this version of the bill. But I'm just making this statement that after balancing out all these different factors, including the factor which you mentioned, this is the balance that we believe will be optimal that will deliver us the economic results that we are targeting and that we feel that the country needs.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, good sponsor. Mr. President, I receive a message from our good majority leader. I think he has some interjection on the same topic.
you.
Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. May I be recognized?
Yes, please proceed,
Thank you.
Majority.
Thank you, Mr. President. With the indulgence of our